Good evening. This is Forum Daily for Wednesday, December 21st. I'm Nathaniel Dueck, filling in for Nima Rajan. We start the newscast tonight with Statistics Canada's inflation reading for November. The annual inflation rate edged down from 6.9% in October to 6.8% last month. This as slower price growth for gasoline and furniture was offset by rapidly rising shelter costs and stubbornly high grocery prices. Grocery prices rose 11.4%, up from 11% in October. Mortgage interest costs were 14.5% higher, while rent was up 5.9%. Statistics Canada says there is upward pressure on rent prices as more Canadians are priced out of home ownership because of high interest rates. Well, meanwhile, holiday plans are being upended by the weather, with travelers stranded at Vancouver's airport and a massive storm about to hit several other provinces. The snow that hit southern BC forced what the airport authority called an unprecedented suspension of flights. Environment Canada has issued extreme cold and Arctic outflow warnings across Alberta, Saskatchewan, parts of Manitoba, and Yukon. A major winter storm is expected to start hitting the Great Lakes region and points eastward late tomorrow. Well, turning now to details on the Vaughan condo shooting. The three daughters of the 73-year-old man who shot and killed 5 neighbors in a Toronto area condo Sunday evening say he was a controlling and abusive husband and father. The 3 were all estranged from Francesco Villi. The women told Ontario's Special Investigations Unit that their father had an aggressive Jekyll and Hyde-like personality and refused their offers to help him. They say they are deeply heartbroken for the victims' families. Well, ahead of the holiday season, Quebec's 811 medical appointment booking system is going province-wide. The call-in service that lets parents book urgent medical appointments for sick children started out only being available in the Montreal area. But in an effort to reduce emergency room visits, which are only expected to rise over the holidays, the province is now expanding it. On the East Coast, a Halifax doctor and medical researcher says the city's emergency department is seeing a rising number of patients who are admitted solely because of social circumstances. Dr. Jasmine Ma says these patients include older people struggling to access home care or housing support. Dr. Ma says she's found that over the holidays, the hospital sees a surge in these kinds of admissions, involving patients who do not have an acute medical issue but end up in hospital because they need care. She says that last year, Halifax's QE2 Health Sciences Centre Emergency Department recorded 109 cases of these patients, and that the hospital is on track to see 120 cases in 2022. The federal government announced new regulations today designed to put more electric vehicles on Canadian streets and highways. 20% of all passenger cars, SUVs, and trucks sold in the country will need to run on electricity by 2026. The mandate will hit 60% by 2030 and 100% by 2035. Last year, electric vehicle sales ran at just 5.2%. Well, in Ontario, a joint investigation between several police services has recovered more than 200 stolen vehicles. York Regional Police say Project Touchdown included Peel, Durham, and Halton Regional Police. They say the 6-month investigation officers recovered or intercepted 215 vehicles that were trafficked to international destinations, along with guns and drugs. Police say 51 people have been arrested and 150 charges laid. Well, 2022 is going into the history books as one where Canada's population grew more than in any other year since Confederation. Statistics Canada reports the population grew by 362,453 between July and October. This is partly due to an influx of people fleeing the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That 3-month figure is more than the population growth for all of 2011. Well, back to inflation now, where Statistics Canada data shows soaring food prices continue to be a major source of inflation. The report for November showed bread, eggs, and dairy products all shot higher last month compared to a year earlier. Coffee and tea prices were up 16.8%. Edible fats and oils climbed 26%. Eggs rose 16.7%, while bread rolls and buns were up 18.2%. Experts say France, Germany, and the UK all have even higher food inflation rates, and that prices are rising due to higher labor, packaging, and energy costs. Well, even as food banks see increased use this year, people are finding ways to give back. For instance, in Saskatchewan, where hunters have donated 135 kilograms of meat to the Saskatoon Food Bank. The donation from the Saskatoon Wildlife Federation includes elk, deer, and moose meat. The Federation says its Hunt for Hunger program allows hunters to donate any extra meat from animals they take down during the hunting season. The food bank says the need for donations this holiday season remains high. Well, up next, we'll have a look at the COP15 biodiversity agreement that was reached in Montreal this week. Stay with us. Forum Daily, we'll be right back. Nearly 200 countries around the world, including Canada, now have 8 years to set aside almost 1/3 of their land and marine territories for conservation. The landmark new biodiversity deal was reached at the United Nations COP15 talks in Montreal on Monday. The UN says 17% of the world's land and 10% of its marine areas are currently protected. Canada has protected about 14% of both. With us to discuss the details of this new global agreement and what it means for the future is Mr. Jay Ritchlin, Nature Director and Director General for Western Canada with the David Suzuki Foundation. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Good afternoon. It's really nice to be with you.
Great to have you here. We know you were at the conference now, and of course you were there receiving or participating with the intro and the agreement itself. So can you give our viewers a bit of an overview of the main planks of this global agreement?
Yeah, I can. There are 4 key goals and about 23, well, exactly 23 targets that are supposed to get us to a world by 2050 where we are living in balance with nature and supplying humans' needs, and nature can continue to help people. So a few of the biggest things that came out of this agreement was the deep integration of Indigenous people, their rights, their knowledge, and their ability to manage their territories. A real commitment to halting and reversing nature loss and species loss, which was a big win, as well as some new elements around funding for the developing world, which was a huge part of what we were hoping to get out of that.
Now, I mean,
The thing I would, sorry, I apologize. One thing I would say is for the first time, pesticides, plastics, and pollution were recognized as a big part of what's driving biodiversity loss.
interesting. That is an interesting point. Now, how significant is this agreement overall to global conservation efforts?
This is the next 10 years of action plan underneath what's called the Convention on Biological Diversity. So every country, over 190 countries committed to being part of this. They each have to go make their own national action plans, though, and here at home in Canada, we'll be working very hard to make sure that Canada is stringent and is kept up with.
And I appreciate you bringing up Canada. We're talking about global agreements here, but let's bring this to people living in this country specifically. So what does this deal at COP15 mean for people living here?
Well, we really have to get on to figuring out how to protect 30% of our land and our oceans, and the current government is making efforts on that. We're enabling a lot more Indigenous participation by funding Indigenous protected areas and a National Guardians program for Indigenous people. And we've got to really start looking at how to reduce the damage. So the halting part is the biggest piece we've got to get to. Old growth forests, coastal areas, grasslands and peatlands that store lots of carbon. We've got to figure out how to retune our economy so that we're putting money into restoration and directing funds to that rather than just extraction.
Going back to the talks themselves, I know there was a bit of disagreement around the compensation agreement or arrangement between developed and developing countries. So I guess, has what the UN Deputy Secretary General called a trust deficit been addressed in this conference?
Well, it was really apparent at the conference. There was a walkout by the developing nations. There was quite a bit of controversy when at 3:30 in the morning, the global framework was adopted, and some African countries were upset about the process. But ultimately, we did get some really good commitments. Canada has become the 7th largest contributor to what's known as the Global Environment Facility, which will help bring funds to the developing world. But, the rich world got rich in many ways through colonial practices that extracted wealth from the developing world. And for them to be able to protect their areas that are left and still give their people a good quality of life, we need to help.
I suppose if we move on now to, say, the COP15 conference and its agreement, does this conference serve as a good model for future conservation efforts worldwide? Despite the agreements, there was, or the disagreements, there was an agreement reached. So is this a good model?
Well, this sets the pace for the next 10 years in the Global Conservation Agreement. We also have a High Seas Treaty coming up and something called Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions, the BBNJ. So if we can get the kind of agreement and the kind of collaboration that we saw eventually come forward here, remember that we need to supply resources and really zero in on the fact that businesses and industries have got to be put under the microscope. It can't all be just about governments and NGOs. The companies that make money extracting from the natural world need to be part of this as well.
Well, Mr. Jay Ritchlin, thank you for joining us on Forum Daily today. There's a lot to take in there and a lot more we'll have to check back on as this agreement unfolds.
Thanks very much. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. All right, stay with us. When we come back from commercial break, we'll be taking a look at the recent shortage of painkillers and other pharmaceuticals in Canada amid a surge of the flu, the RSV, and the COVID-19 cases in children and adults. We'll be speaking with Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director of Appletree Medical Group, up next. Stay tuned. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he's focused on solving the problem of drug shortages using the most efficient approach, even if that means sourcing medications from other places in the world. He says he's not sure if ramping up domestic production of pharmaceuticals is the right answer or if it would be best to get a more reliable supply chain and agreements therein. Canada has been experiencing a nationwide shortage of children's pain medications for months, leaving parents scrambling as rates of respiratory syncytial virus and influenza skyrocket. With us to discuss the spread of respiratory viruses across the country is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome to Forum Daily.
Pleasure to be here.
So what have you been hearing from parents yourself about the shortage of children's pain medications?
Well, right now we are seeing a major drug shortage of children's Tylenol, Advil, including all generic forms. And this is happening in the middle of flu season, RSV, and COVID-19. I know of a parent last week who went to 5 different pharmacies in order to get the medication for her child. So one theme I'm really hearing from parents is frustration and helplessness. It's tremendously hard to see your child suffer from symptoms that could have very easily been treated in other years.
It's interesting, and you're talking on children in particular here. Why do they seem particularly at risk from influenza and RSV this season?
Well, I think the rising numbers are definitely concerning here. We've seen 1 in 56 otherwise healthy babies are hospitalized now with RSV during their first year of life, and that was a study that came out of the Lancet recently. And the reason that we're seeing that increase is likely because many children were in fact shielded from common infections during all the multiple lockdowns. So in the past 2 years, the virus has now encountered a vulnerable population of babies and children who were sheltered from these common bugs during the pandemic. And that's why we are now seeing a large number of infections this year, and early infections at that, for both RSV and influenza.
You know, children are sheltered, but we're seeing rising numbers of older Canadians who are also suffering with these infections as well. So how are they faring through this season?
Well, respiratory tract infections in general are still the leading cause of death due to infectious disease in the elderly. And there's many reasons for that: waning immune systems, onset of age-associated organ dysfunction. So we're always particularly concerned about the elderly there. What we find in particular, especially in Canada, is those with COPD and other organ disease and above the age of 65 are particularly hit with these illnesses here.
Well, we talked about younger Canadians and older Canadians. Are there any other demographics that face a heightened risk of infection across the country in this season?
Yes, we typically see people with chronic disease, so asthma, heart disease, and stroke, diabetes, and kidney disease. We also have people with immune systems that are not up to peak, so HIV/AIDS and cancer, for instance, will have a decreased immune system for these patients. Other people include pregnant people, people living in nursing homes or long-term care facilities, and many racial and ethnic minority groups, including our Indigenous people, are at particular risk.
Some concerning information there for us all to consider. Now, we've been hearing a lot about infection rates for both influenza and RSV. For viewers at home, how can they tell the difference between these two different viruses?
So during winter, it's definitely common to come down with a stuffy nose or a sore throat. And every year we see a lot of viruses causing hundreds of millions of these infections. And we just call them colds in general, or cold and flu. But this year, what we're seeing is a cold. It could be COVID-19, it could be the flu, it could be RSV. So telling those apart is tricky. The only real way to tell them apart is to get tested, but your symptoms can give you a bit of a clue on what you would necessarily have. For instance, flu symptoms tend to start all of a sudden, whereas COVID and RSV tend to be a bit more gradual. And we also see fever, for instance, more common in flu and COVID rather than RSV in healthier populations.
Interesting. Now, moving to treatment here, what is the best way to treat these infections?
I think that's the first thing we should talk about, what not to do because of the shortage here. For instance, do not give your child adult strength medications. You could be severely overdosing them. And don't give your child aspirin because it can cause significant complications. But if you don't have the ability to get the Tylenol, Advil in cases of fever, you want to dress your child lightly because the excess clothing can trap a lot of body heat. Give your child a lot of fluids such as water, juices, and popsicles, and a lukewarm bath can also be very helpful in bringing those fevers down.
Quick 15, 20 seconds, Dr. Raut. How can people stay safe this holiday season?
I think the most important thing here is prevention. So vaccination is still the best way from getting severely ill from influenza and COVID. So if your child hasn't been vaccinated for those yet or haven't received the booster for COVID, I think now is the time there. And then finally, if you do feel a cold coming on, just get some rest, get a test, and stay at home.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky traveled to Washington, D.C. today in what has been described as his first known trip outside of Ukraine since Russia invaded. Just before his arrival, the U.S. announced its largest single delivery of arms to Ukraine, including Patriot surface-to-air missiles. Russian President Vladimir Putin is warning that increasing the supply of U.S. arms to Ukraine is only going to aggravate the war. Meanwhile, Russia's defense chief has announced a plan to increase Russia's military from 1 million to 1.5 million personnel. In Africa, international pressure is growing on Rwanda. France is the latest party to openly accuse the country of supporting armed rebels in neighboring eastern Congo. This comes with possible repercussions for foreign aid that Kigali has long enjoyed. For months, the renewed attacks by the M23 rebels have angered Congo's government and led to talk of war. A report by United Nations experts earlier this year said it had solid evidence that Rwanda's armed forces were backing the rebels, while the United States has openly asked Rwanda to stop it. Rwanda denies the allegations and calls the violence Congo's problem. In yet another major blow to human rights in Afghanistan, the Taliban has banned female students from attending universities. The move comes despite initially promising a more moderate rule, including respecting women's and minority rights after their takeover last year. The head of the United Nations has condemned the decision, calling it another broken promise from the Taliban. South of our border, a large swath of the United States is bracing for a dangerous mix of sub-zero temperatures, howling winds, and blizzard conditions that are already hammering the Northwest. Bitter cold and heavy snow are forecast to hit the plains and upper Midwest. Some places in the northern U.S. could see wind chills approaching minus 57 degrees Celsius. Even warm weather states like Florida and Texas are preparing for a chill. While Twitter continues to make headlines, with new owner Elon Musk saying he plans to stay on as the platform's CEO until he can find someone willing to replace him in the job. Mr. Musk's announcement came after millions of Twitter users asked him to step down in an unscientific poll that the billionaire himself created and vowed to abide by. Since buying the San Francisco-based social media platform in October for $44 billion, Mr. Musk's run as Twitter CEO has been marked by quickly issued policies that have often been withdrawn or changed in short order. He's also alienated some investors in his electric vehicle company, Tesla, who are concerned that Twitter is taking up too much of his attention. Well, ahead of the holiday gift-giving tradition, the Wall Street Journal is calling it a bow session. The paper is reporting that the California company, which makes the giant red bows you see on TV commercials, advertising cars as Christmas presents, saw orders drop 35% from last year. The Journal says tracking bow sales could help track how many new cars will be given as presents this year. Moving to a large-scale Japanese study now, which looked at high blood pressure and coffee consumption. It found the risk of heart disease-related death is increased in people with high blood pressure who drink high levels of coffee. Now that is defined as 2 or more cups per day. But researchers didn't find any association between coffee consumption and the risk of heart disease-related death in people who have normal blood pressure or mild hypertension. In comments after the 2022 World Cup ended in Qatar, former FIFA president Sepp Blatter has criticized plans by his successor, Gianni Infantino, for a 48-team World Cup. Mr. Blatter said that, quote, "What is happening at the moment is an over-commercialization of the game." The 2026 World Cup in the United States, Mexico, and Canada will be the first 48-nation tournament. This year's tournament in Qatar featured 32 teams. Meanwhile, a parade in Buenos Aires to celebrate the return of Argentina's World Cup champion team was abruptly cut short yesterday. Millions of people poured onto streets, highways, and overpasses in a chaotic attempt to catch a glimpse of the victorious team members. So many jubilant fans swarmed the Argentine capital on Tuesday that players were forced to abandon the open-air bus taking them to the capital. They instead boarded helicopters for a capital flyover that the government billed as an aerial parade. While kids have been building houses, cars, castles, and spaceships out of Lego for generations, now some adults are building their investment portfolios with the little plastic blocks. As with any investment, the law of supply and demand applies. Analysts say rare Lego kits that have been discontinued can fetch the most on the secondary market, so long as it hasn't been opened. Well, I'm Nathaniel Dueck, filling in for Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can visit our website at thenewsforum.ca and make sure to follow us on our social media handles. We're available on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also watch all our commentary programming and interviews on the News Forum YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us today on Forum Daily News, and we'll see you again next time. Take care, Canada, and be well.